From advertising to software as a service to data.
Across all of our programs and clients, we've seen a 55 to 65% open rate.
Getting brands authentically integrated into content performs better than TV advertising.
Typical lifespan of an article is about 24 to 36 hours.
If we're reaching out to the right person with the right message and a clear call to action, then it's just a matter of timing.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast, a Ben J. Schaap LLC production. In this podcast, you'll hear the stories of world-class marketers that use technology to drive business results and achieve career success. We'll unearth the real-world experiences of some of the brightest minds in the marketing and technology space so you can learn the tools, tips, and tricks they've learned along the way. Now here's the host of the MarTech Podcast, Benjamin Shapiro.
Welcome back to the MarTech Podcast. Today we're going to talk about a medium of marketing that is obviously near and dear to my heart, podcasting. To give you a little context for those of you who are new to listening to this podcast, it's been almost 3 months since we launched, and each month I give an overview of how I think about marketing for this podcast. As a part of our marketing mix, we tested running Google AdWords campaigns last month and found that keywords related to the topic how to grow podcast generated some of our highest click-through rates. I'm taking that as a signal that we should focus more of our efforts on teaching you, our listeners, about creating podcasts and podcast growth. So today we're going to talk to Carey Green, who is the founder of Podcast Fast Track, which is a podcast production agency that helps podcasters of all levels automate their podcasting efforts. This week, we're also going to do something a little different. We're going to publish one episode covering a specific topic each day, and they're all going to be related to podcasting. Today, Carey is going to talk us through his background and the first of his 5 keys to building and scaling a podcast. Here's our interview with Carey Green from Podcast Fast Track. So, Carey, welcome to the MarTech Podcast.
Thanks so much, Ben. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have an expert in podcast creation and advertising on our podcast. And why don't we start off by giving a little bit of context for our listeners? Tell us about your background.
Well, my background had nothing to do with podcasting until about 5 years ago. I was a pastor for 20-some years, serving in small churches throughout the United States. I did have a radio background from my college days, so I was interested in audio, just never had the time to really mess with it until about 5 years ago when I stepped out of that career, and digital audio was on the scene by then, and it was very intriguing to me, so I started playing around with it. Started my own podcast, began helping other people with their podcasts just as kind of a way to put some food on the table. And one of my people that I was helping at the time was a friend I'd met over the internet. And he just one time in the middle of one of our conversations about his podcast said, "You should do this as a business." And it was like the biggest light bulb that's ever gone off in my brain because I knew the pain point of podcasting already and that there was definitely a business model there to be found. So I got started back in 2013 working on podcasting and providing all kinds of services for podcasters who are in love with their podcast, but too busy to do all the back end work.
We're going to talk a lot about what your services are in depth over the rest of the week, but just give us an overview of what Podcast Fast Track is and what are the services you provide to your customers.
Sure. Podcast Fast Track is really a full service podcast production company. We can do everything from concierge type podcasting where somebody wants us to set up everything for their interview, for example, and they just show up and we record it, do all the editing, show notes, posting to the website, even promotional materials like audiograms and that kind of stuff we can create from scratch, unique to the client. Or if it's not a concierge thing, we can do all of those production and post-production things also for podcasters who don't mind setting up their own things and just want to provide us the audio files. We can take that and provide all the resources they need, as much or as little. And we do that on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, monthly basis, whatever they need. We also provide launch consulting, all that kind of stuff that goes along with people who need expertise in getting into the industry.
So you really work with podcasters of all different levels of experience, people that are creating new podcasts and helping them with some consulting, people that want to automate some of their services, and then people that are experienced podcasters as well.
Yeah, any of the above.
So tell me why the podcast industry and podcast as a marketing channel is so interesting to you, and tell us about what you know about the medium of podcasting and its growth.
Well, podcasting is interesting to me because of the buzzing little box we all have in our pockets. Smartphones have made it so easy to learn on the go, to learn wherever you are. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were in New York City for a visit, and we were on the subway a lot. And I just noticed people all the time had earbuds in, sitting there as they're commuting to work. I do the same thing when I'm commuting from where I live into Denver, which is the nearest large city. I always load up my app with podcasts and I'm listening. And I think the mobility that we have for learning is really the opportunity behind podcasting. You're able to learn anything you want. You're able to be entertained with great stories. You're able to tune into a history podcast and bone up on your history if that's of interest to you. You can even find out about chameleon breeding through a very successful podcast on that topic.
Chameleon breeding.
Truly, there is a very successful podcast on chameleon breeding. Very small audience, but you can imagine a very passionate one.
Right.
And the thing I've noticed about podcasting since I've gotten into it in 2013 is that the growth curve has done nothing but go up. We've had a stat released this last week. This is June of 2018, that there are over 550,000 podcasts in the iTunes directory now. And there are something like 2,500 new ones being added every week. That is incredible. And it just goes to show that people are finding podcasts. People are beginning to really get addicted to them. And it's a great medium for anybody who wants to get right in the earbuds of the very audience who wants what they have to offer.
There's a couple of things that I think are interesting about where podcasting is as a medium right now. To me, there's a trend for people to move away from terrestrial radio, listening to the radio in your car and looking for more on-demand services. So there's the trend for like what's happening in television where people aren't tuning in at a specific time, but looking for content that they know they want to consume, like what's happening with Netflix and Amazon Prime. So that's happening in audio. And on the flip side, where you're talking about 550,000 podcasts being available and more being added every day, there's a lot of content that's out there and it's very rich. On the flip side, when you look at written content, the blog posts and articles and the topics that are covered in text, the amount of content that's in the podcast in audio that's been created and published is relatively small compared to if you're looking for an article on Google. So I think that there's still a lot of room for growth.
Sure.
Tell me about where you see the biggest areas for growth in the podcast industry and who's getting involved in the podcasting space.
I don't have a crystal ball for sure. There's been a lot of things happen in podcasting already that I would not have foreseen, like the advent of story-based podcasts and dramatized podcasts and how big they've become. I was just learning from them. They were coaches and entrepreneurs and business people explaining what they did and teaching what they did when I got involved. And now you've got all kinds of crazy things out there that are actually gaining lots of traction. So it's hard for me to say what kinds of things I see on the horizon. I see nothing but growth on the horizon for at least the short term. And as far as the kinds of people who are getting into podcasting, it's everybody from hobbyists who just love to talk about their Dungeons and Dragons or their knitting or whatever, all the way up to corporations who are doing more and more podcasts. I mean, just this last month, we saw the debut of Skull Candy doing their own podcast and other big name companies who are getting into the podcasting space. And it's all about building a community around your brand, which I think is an incredibly genius way to go about promoting your brand and fostering client loyalty. Because the more they love your podcast, the more they're going to be engaged with the things you sell.
So talk to me a little bit about that. I'm interested in hearing about your views on how companies are creating podcast content and what the rationale behind that is, and how do companies create community?
I think that the ways that people are creating their content happens in a variety of manners. There are some creators who are doing Facebook Live sessions and they're doing a Q&A on Facebook Live and they'll have this interaction there and build community, but then they will repurpose that audio into a podcast. And many times those two audiences are very different audiences, but the content is relevant to both. So they're using that magical word, repurpose, to do the work once and then have it changed into a different format so they can reach a wider audience. I think that's ingenious. There are a lot of people who are doing what we're doing right now, having conversations with experts in their industry and picking their brain about the things they've learned in the industry and then passing that on to others in the industry as a method toward promoting their own coaching service or their own expertise in the industry. There are people who are putting their books online in a spoken word form, in podcasts, free of charge, as a lost leader, so to speak, leading toward buying the actual print copy or e-copy of their book. There are just all kinds of ways that people are using podcasting to expand their brand, I guess is the way that you would say it. And as far as how that's happening, there are just as many ways as you can think of. I mean, the human being is so creative. People are coming up with new ways of doing it all the time.
You mentioned something interesting, which was finding a very targeted audience. Tell me what you know about people who are listening to podcasts. How should people that are marketers or interested in marketing and technology think about the audience in podcasting?
Well, I definitely think you need to think in terms of niche audience, because every podcast obviously has a topic or a sphere in which they're speaking. In your example, marketing and tech. You need to be able to present your content in a way that people who are consuming information about that subject matter are going to find appealing. So it takes a lot of research on who your customers would be, who your ideal clients would be. Many podcasters who are really serious about it are actually creating client avatars or personas. That is Mike the marketer or whoever, that they're trying to figure out who it is that they're aiming for. And they design everything they do in their podcast in a way that would be appealing to that demographic and that person. Whether it's a chameleon breeding podcast or a marketing podcast, I think that's the way to go. You have to think of how will my content benefit my listeners? What's the value that I bring to the table? And the more that you can provide value, the more you're going to be able to build that listener loyalty and have people then begin virally sharing your content because they love it so much. And it's the people who are in that space, in that niche, who know others who are in the niche and are willing to spread the word.
So if I had to summarize, the podcast industry is not only something that's growing rapidly, there's a fair amount of content that's there, but a lot of opportunities in terms of reaching niche audiences. They're also a very educated and generally have a higher household income, probably because of the access to smartphones where they can consume a lot of audio. Okay, that's a good stopping point, and we're going to wrap up this episode of the MarTech Podcast. Thanks to Carey Green from Podcast Fast Track for joining us. If you'd like to hear the rest of Carey's tips for growing a podcast, we'll publish an episode every day this week. So hit that subscribe button in your podcast app and check back with us tomorrow morning for the next episode. If you can't wait until tomorrow and you'd like to learn more about Carey and his business, go to podcastfasttrack.com. podcastfasttrack.com. And if you'd like to read the transcript of this podcast, we've published on our website, martechpod.com. If you're a subscriber to the MarTech Podcast, thank you very much. We want you to feel like a member of our community, so if you ever have any questions or you'd like to be a guest on the show, feel free to reach out to us directly. You can find a contact link on our website, martechpod.com. You can also find us on Twitter and LinkedIn by searching Ben J. Shap, LLC. We'd also love for you to leave us a review in the Apple iTunes store. And if you haven't already subscribed to this podcast and you want a weekly stream of marketing and technology knowledge in your podcast feed, in addition to the next episode of our conversation with Carey Green, we've got some other great episodes lined up in the next few weeks. So hit that subscribe button and we'll bring you some great content related to marketing and technology. Okay, that's it for today. In tomorrow's episode, we're going to talk about what it takes to start growing a podcast. Until next time, my advice is to just focus on keeping your customers happy.